Okay, perfect. Well, first, welcome everyone to the second day of our 2022 annual meeting, the Washington State Society of American Foresters. I want to say that I'm real glad that everyone's here today. I want to thank you all for attending, both our participants, our speakers. I'd like to thank our sponsors and the committee members and the Northwest office for making this possible. Our theme for today is economics, and we have 4 talks lined up. First 2, we'll have Brooks Mendel is going to talk to us about market trends. After him, we'll have Rob Janicki and Dan Rankin talking about a carbon project and economic opportunities in the Darrington area, Washington. And then after them, we'll have 2 groups of Green River students who will be talking to us about the diversity of macroinvertebrates in natural and artificial wetlands and in a stream before and after an atmospheric river event. Given that, I'm going to move on to the first talk today. Unless Andrew, do you want to say anything preface?
Nope, I think we're good. Oh, and then for CFEs at the end of the meeting, a CFE link to the online survey will be shared, as with the password for the day. Any questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. But we also have a small enough group that when it comes to the Q&A, if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. So our first talk today is going to be Brooks Mendel. He is the president and CEO of Forest Consulting. He's got 3 decades of experience in the forest products and timber industry, including work in research, operations, and consulting. And today he's going to talk to us about current trends and changes in forest markets. So Brooks, if you're ready, I'm going to hand it over to you.
You got it. Thanks, Elijah, for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and pop up my screen for the group. Here we go. And it's fun clicking through the names because it's fun seeing some familiar names out there on the meeting. I have a lot of friends in the Pacific Northwest. It's where I started my career years ago in the 90s, where I learned how to scale and sort logs poorly near Aberdeen, Washington. And then I worked for a bit in Raymond, Washington before moving south, where I've been for over 25 years now. And as you mentioned, we run a small business here and we have an office out west. And so I'm going to touch on a few themes related to economics and to markets. I'm very mindful of the fact that when I'm talking about markets, either the current situation or the past, or even when we're starting to look forward, there's this constant cycling up and down. And you don't really need to be a Mensa member to know how bad things could get or how good things could get. But sometimes the world intervenes and somebody knocks over the chessboard. And we've got a little bit of that going on right now with Russia and Ukraine, and with oil prices and with inflation. And so I am mindful of those big, broader themes. That said, whenever we're talking about forestry, there are 3 themes that are always relevant. One is the fact that every timber market or wood basket is uniquely local. Everything has its own profile within the broader scheme of things. The second is that it is important to ask good questions about the data we're looking at, because our understanding of a situation is a function of the quality of the data. And then, at the end of the day, we want to know what's knowable. So in my world, we spend a lot of time just trying to confirm the situation on the ground so that we can sort of paint a picture. So I want to thank the Washington SAF for inviting me to participate. And I'm going to touch on the following themes. I've got, including the slide you're looking at, 11 slides. And I'm going to give a brief overview of what we do here at our shop and what we're doing now. Talk a little bit about the macro environment, really being just touch on inflation and housing. Then I'm going to talk about the sawmill sector, talk about the pulp and paper sector, talk a little bit about sustainability metrics in the Pacific Northwest, touch on logging and supply chain, and I'm going to wrap up with a quick update on the institutional investment deal flow on timberlands in the U.S., because that gives us a sense to wrap up so that maybe we can take a look forward and see what's being teed up for the future. A little bit about our shop. We've been in business 18 years. I'm based in Athens, Georgia, and we have 10 people on our team, and we have a small office in Vancouver, Washington. And everybody in our team has sort of grew up in the forest products industry. So I do like to tell people we're probably some of the nerdiest foresters you'll ever meet, because we've all been in the woods, but we are also we like data. We're very interested in tracking all the mills and the forest supplies and trying to understand how they work together. And we produce quarterly research and our clients subscribe to our research. And sometimes we do market studies for them to help them make decisions about what they're going to do next. And we teach classes, and we have one coming up next month, Applied Force Finance. I teach it a couple times each year, where we just talk about the sort of the blocking and tackling economic decisions that forest owners make every day. That said, even when we're doing sort of this bottom-up work, which is where we emphasize, when you start taking a position on what things are going to look like in the future, you do have to have a point of view. So I want to share a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of housing and inflation. This is a brief summary of a housing outlook that we put together every quarter, but I want to start by talking about inflation first, because it's so timely, it's so hot, it's on the front page every single day. And so I'm constantly sort of tracking the market for, I call it the market for money, which is what interest rates are and what the Fed is charging everybody and what mortgage rates are doing and how much you're going to have to pay for if you're going to have to borrow to buy a car. Car prices have been up. But inflation is that, it's really the price of the price of money, the real change in the cost of goods that we have to buy every day to just make things work and to live. And we're used to living in a world, and almost my entire adult life has been in a world where, for most of it, has been where inflation has been like a couple percent, 1 or 2%, where you almost don't feel it until you start to add it up over 5 or 10 year spans. But in January of this year, I'm going to speak to January for a moment before I talk to the current spot. Inflation in the United States hit 7.5%, 7.5% growth in costs on average price of goods that we have to buy every day. 7.5%. That's a big number. If you did that every single month for a year, that's a massive number, right? You're talking about things almost doubling. So what's in that 7.5%? I'm always very interested in context. And when you start to break it out like an onion and parse it out, and you look at where those price increases occurred, let's talk about the 7.5%. So it turns out about 1% of the 7.5% was food. About 1.7% of the 7.5% was energy, and most of that was the price of gas. And then the remaining 4.8% was other stuff. All right, so let's bring the other stuff over. What's in the other stuff? Well, there's a lot of things in the other stuff, but the two biggest buckets are cars and houses. Cost of housing, rent, mortgage, those kinds of things. But in the cars, that accounted for about another 1.7 of the total. And when you break that thing down, well over 1% of it was used cars. There was more cost increase associated with used cars in January than there was with food. So that's interesting to me, because the cost of food and energy hits all of us every single day. But then I'm interested in these other things which hit us periodically. So cars is a good one because used cars is an easier thing to track. And what's interesting to me about used cars is it was such a big number at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And then you start to look at last month's number, and all of a sudden, used car prices are falling. They're no longer increasing, they're actually going the other direction. So when you break these big inflation headline numbers into their parts, you see that there are small pieces that hit us hard every single day, food and energy. And there are other things that actually are changing every single month. So January's 7.5 is different than March's 7.5. And for me, that's an important lesson. I'm very mindful of, I'm hearing a big number, but what's in that thing? And day to day, I'm more interested in food and energy, but then I'm looking at the other big buckets, because if they're constantly changing, just looking at the headline number can be a little bit misleading. So I'm sensitive to that when I'm looking at the economy. Same is true for housing, which is this figure here. You got, I'm using my cursor here, and you'll see, like, if this is the history of housing starts over time, and then the forecasts begin here, and that's these dotted lines. So every quarter we update a housing outlook, and the way we do this is we take an average of a bunch of other housing forecasts, because we're not housing experts. We know more about forestry and stuff in the field. And our number for this year, by taking an average of a bunch of other forecasts, is just over 1.6 million housing starts, just over. We ended last year just under 1.6 million housing starts. What's remarkable about the history, the reason I like this figure, I'm highlighting this trend, is the history of the past 10 years of housing it's almost unique in its shape and trend. So typically, if you look at the past 50 years in the United States, for every 5 years, there's 3 years of housing increasing and 2 years of housing decreasing. That's the normal. I mean, we've all lived that. It goes like this over time. The trend is up overall, but it's 3 ups and 2 downs. Well, we had 10 consecutive years of how, I mean, we went in the toilet 2007, 8, 9, and then between 2011 and 2021, over 11-year cycle, we went from 0.6 to 1.6. 1 million housing start annual growth to where we are now. And so we're sort of back at par, back at level. And when you start to look forward, people got used to this idea that we're going to be growing every year. But the expectation is now that in the next few years, we're going to have a housing decrease. We're just going to have fewer houses to build, or the need is there, or the supply chain is going to hold us up. And when we look at all the different forecasters, there's, for every 5 that we look at, looking into this year, 2022, 3 think housing starts are going to be higher this year, 2 think it's going to be lower. The spread's about 200,000. When you look into 2023, there more think it's going to fall than it's going to increase. The spread between the high and the low is 300,000 housing starts. So what my take home from that and my message that I'm sharing with you is there's a lot of uncertainty about, are we going to be up or down over the next few years? But there's a lot of agreement that we're sort of in this trough now, or we're sort of moving in this trough for a while, unless something really big hits us like it did in 2007. So we use this and we take this 1.5, 1.6 million housing starts, and we look to the future and see what it implies for us for the forest products industry. This is a figure of where softwood lumber comes from in the United States. And this is the history of our sector along with a forward look. So from here to here is 1990 to 2020. So you got basically 30 years of history. And then from here to here is 10 years of projection, the dotted lines. And you got 3 lines here. Back in the 90s, the Pacific Northwest was the largest supplier of softwood lumber to the United States. In the 2000s, the largest supplier was Canada through imports. And then since 2006, where all the lines crossed, the US South has been the largest producer of softwood lumber. We have the most capacity in the South. I say we because it's where I'm located. And the dotted lines are mostly a function of where the mills are. That's how we do our work. It's basically, the forest products industry is really just a lot of adding and subtracting. Trees are growing and we harvest and we plant and we harvest and we plant and we harvest. Where are the mills? Are we building mills or closing mills? We're adding and subtracting. And we're constantly adding and subtracting these boxes together to see where things are going and what could actually be operable in the sector. So if someone says we're going to need 45 billion board feet of lumber in the United States, my question is, where's it going to come from? And we start adding up boxes. Where are the mills? And most of the boxes are in the US South. This is what this tells us over here. We've had big numbers. In the US South, we're going to, at the end of this year, it's going to be about 25 billion board feet of capacity, that ability to basically feed, account for we're getting close to 60% of what the US needs in terms of softwood lumber is going to be coming from the US South, well over 50% for a really long time. And the West closed, got smaller partly because we're harvesting so few trees off of public lands. That's why the West is smaller. And then Canada has been shrinking as well. In Canada, Western Canada in particular, lost another couple billion board feet of capacity over the past several years. And the beneficiary of that has been the US industry. And in the US, the primary beneficiary of that has been the US South. That said, people are still investing capital in the West. WKO bought the SDS mills. You had Canfor buy mills in Western Canada. I picked up a couple sawmills from Miller Industries, and then also a secondary facility. So there is capital flowing into the West. And in a way, in terms of technology, the West has always led the South, partly because log costs are higher. So people had to be more efficient. That said, just to give you a picture of the South, I'll just share, this will be my One South slide. So you have an idea of what we're looking at down here. This is a map of the US South. Again, we're tracking all the wood using mills on an ongoing basis. And these are the softwood lumber mills in the South. You can see like green is brand new facilities, and orange is a facility that's investing to get bigger, and blue is reopening. So you can see all the colors. You can see all the colors here. There's 4 ways to increase lumber production capacity. One is to expand an existing mill. Another one is to reopen a closed one. Another one is to build a new one. You see all 3 of those here. And the 4th way is to add shifts. And all 4 of those things have been happening in the South. That's where the capital's going. And the primary reason for that has been because the timber supplies have been growing. They're so in the South, the forest, if you just look at the volume of wood on the stump down here, it's about 40% higher today than it was 15 years ago. The recession helped drive that. All these trees got planted and then they grew during the recession. And now the South is sitting on just this big endowment of trees, and the capital, the iron goes to the wood, the iron goes to the resource. But people took their mills and they parked them where the trees are, and that's how you had this big shift. And when people park a mill somewhere, that mill's got a 10, 20, 50-year life on it. And so that's a fundamental restructuring a little bit of how the forest products industry works in North America. And then when you think about sawmills, of course, now we roll over to pulp mills, which last even longer than sawmills. And the capital for these guys is even bigger. And the map here, this is sort of a 3-year snapshot, a little bit of history and a little bit of outlook. So it's got 20, 21, 22. And there's the only pulp mills here. These are wood using pulp mills across North America. These are the ones that have some sort of change occurring. So that's why you don't see hundreds, you see a couple dozen. But the red is where you see decreases or closures. And the green is where you see some sort of capital investment. And as much as you hear about the lumber sector, and there's a lot more projects in the lumber sector, on a relative basis, a lumber project is cheap compared to what a pulp mill costs. And so when you count the dollars in the forest products industry, the big dollars are still associated with what's going on in this sector that we're looking at, the pulp and paper sector. You can see like a lot of the closures, a lot of the red dots have been in the Appalachia region of the United States. We've had some in the Lake States here. Eastern Canada's got some closures, and there's been a little bit out here in the West too. The tough part about this is that in some sectors are going net positive, and even as a country, you can see the tagline on the slide is net from a wood using pulp mill capacity measure, like the ability of pulp mills to use wood to make stuff, is in decline. It's actually, we're going to be 1% lower at the end of this year than we were a couple of years ago. That said, actually the West has been one of the bright spots because of conversions, not from a wood side, but from the pulp mills, because of the ability to use recycled fiber. And the South is still experiencing closures as big as the South is. I mean, just this week, West Rock, which has a strong presence out West too, they announced the closure of the Panama City pulp mill. So older pulp mill, older facility. They produce over 600,000 tons of product. They use over 2 million tons a year of wood, well over 2 million tons. And they make fluff pulp, and they make a type of linerboard, a kraft. And these are good end markets, but West Rock is big, and they've shifted that capacity to more efficient mills. And they've moved it out of one of the higher cost wood basins in the South, which is in South Georgia, North Florida. So things are happening all around the country. But the South is by far the biggest pulp mill, pulp producer, and also pulpwood user. So sometimes it is helpful to look at North America absent the South. So I took the 5 big regions of North America. The way I think about it, the way we think about it here is South, West, North being the Lake States and New England put together, Western Canada and Eastern Canada. And it helps to take the South, US South, off the slide sometimes because the bars are so tall, to let us look a little bit in more detail about where some of the action is, but also to talk about the West for a couple moments here. And these are 2 snapshots. These are how the pulp and paper sectors in these 4 remaining regions, absent the South, have changed over this 3-year period from 2018 to 2021. Pulp and paper sector is super important. It's where the capital is. There's a lot of value created there. In terms of the stock market, that's where a lot of the market cap is located. It's where a lot of jobs are, because each of these facilities is hundreds of jobs, whereas sawmills can be dozens of jobs, especially mid-sized ones. So there's just so much employment, so much economic positive activity associated with the sector. It is helpful to look at a little bit. So if you look at some of these guys, you can see Eastern Canada, it's been a shrinking area. And part of it is that it's been shrinking sort of in end markets that have been weak, like newsprint has shrunk a lot. But on this, if you look at this guy here, specialty, which is 2018, and it got bigger here. So specialty is specialty higher value fibers. That area has grown, not enough to offset the shrinkage in newsprint, but it has been helpful. So this is the newsprint decrease right here. Let's go right to the West. And you can see like it's been pretty steady. And actually, I did mention it's hard to see on a slide like this, but net the West is is the only region, in fact, that has growth over this period. The primary reason has been that the Western mills have invested in the ability to use recycled fiber. But then on the other side, the West, along with the South and Eastern, and even parts of Eastern Canada, are the only parts of the country that are investing in the really strong end markets. So you're talking about the packaging sector and all the boxes, and that ties you to Amazon. You're talking about specialty fibers. You're talking about household, sanitary. That's this blue here. So the blue here in the West it's a nice sector to be in, and the balance of that sector is really in the U.S. South. So that's diapers and related products like that. So when you think about in the West, you hate to see mills go down, but the West is exposed to stronger end markets than our other parts of the sector, and so that's a nice thing to be able to say. A little bit about the sustainability metrics in the Pacific Northwest. We go through this exercise every year where we take all the counties in the coastal Pacific Northwest. We do the same thing in the U.S. South, and we start to model supplies and we match them up to where the wood consumption is of all wood types. And we model the lumber sector separately from ply and from OSB and from pulp and paper and from pellets. And we're very interested in where's capital getting invested and where are people going to be using wood and what kind of wood do they need. And we do these county level growth to drain measures, take a current snapshot, and then we take a snapshot 5 or 10 years in the future. So to give you a proxy, so in the US South, the current numbers are Southwide, so that's across 11 states. And it's just a really big area, and just focusing on private timberlands, which is the same here on this figure for the Northwest. In the South, the Southwide growth to drain currently is about 1.31 in private softwood timberlands. That means we're growing about 30% more wood than we're using every year. But if you forecast it about 5 years out, the South gets to even, about 1.0, which means for every ton we grow, we're harvesting about a ton. And that's because all these mills are being built and expanding. And so the wood use has grown so much, and you saw that on the lumber slide, that we're basically eating up the balance. West is already there. The West, this snapshot from just a year or so ago, on average, the coastal region of the Northwest is a 1.0, basically in balance. And if you forecast this forward about 5 years, you have some places where parts of the West actually get below that 1. Part of it is because of the fires, especially the impact on the Oregon growth to drain. And then you start to roll it forward again because we're managing trees on shorter rotations. You come out of it and you get above 1 again. But basically, you have a very tight situation in the West. And that's part of the reason why prices are more volatile. When things in supply and demand are in balance, prices tend to bounce more. And we see that in the West. And so there's the good and the bad for that, right? The good is that encourages reinvestment in forests and timberlands. It creates job security for people like you and me on the forestry side. And also the mills have nice access to end markets and the export markets, so that encourages them to keep those mills current. And you can even hear, I mentioned that a little bit of M&A activity. People are buying mills and they're upgrading them and they're keeping them current. And so that's encouraging for those of us who are helping others make decisions about whether or not to plant trees, and people are. They're replanting the good timberlands they have overall, which is a nice story to be able to tell. That said, nothing moves without loggers and trucks. And so a couple notes on this. Sean Baker on our team, who leads our research, and his specialty is the supply chain. He's done work in all parts of the continent. A couple things he highlights. One is that he looked at employment in the logging sector before and after the recession of early 2000 and COVID. And so that's what this shows. This shows late 2019 and compares it basically after the recession to mid 2020. And you see a lot of negative numbers here. So you don't like to see that, right? So you see, especially in the big markets in the West, in the South, in Maine, in the Lake States, all these negative numbers. And so that was measured as of the end of last year. And I share this partly to highlight the updated data, which shows that actually in the big key markets, we've seen increases in employment. Where have we seen that? We've seen it in the West, we've seen it in Maine, we've seen it in the South, which is nice. States where you have funky numbers like Kentucky, is partly one reason for that is the data's bad. Remember, my 3 things are: markets are uniquely local, always question the data, and then you know what's knowable. So we're like, why do we have these funky numbers we don't expect to see? You make the calls, you dig in, and you find out places like Missouri and Kentucky the data is not real good. It's not reliable for analysis like this. So we know that. You see Kentucky's got 3%, Missouri's 2%. They didn't actually have those growth rates. They didn't complete data is what they had. But in the big markets with all the bodies, all the people in the sector, we had a drop, and then we've had a recovery in the sector, which is nice. And we look at what do we expect moving forward. And this figure has got 3 lines on it. The blue line is the US workforce. This dark line is truck drivers, and this light green line, whoosh, let's see if I can follow it, mouse gymnastics, is the logging workforce. And this is all about age. As long as I've been doing research in the sector, one of the stories I've either heard told or listened to Sean tell is that loggers are getting older. We're out aging the rest of the workforce. And what's interesting is that now, for one of the first times, the past 5 years, the logging workforce has gotten younger. That's great, right? And it's for all sorts of reasons. You have business owners passing on their logging businesses to their kids. We have new people entering the workforce and buying equipment. In the South, we have guys coming across the border from Mexico and starting logging crews. We have there's all sorts of stuff happening that's sort of rejuvenating the logging sector. The bad news is it's this dark line. It's the log trucking part. So we have a smaller portion of log truckers are below the age of 35. About 25% of log truck drivers are below the age of 25, whereas about 35% of the overall workforce is below the age of 35. Now you have more than 35% of the logging force is below the age of 35. That's the good news. The bad news is the log truck side of it, we're still in a pretty tough spot. And we're seeing it in the cost of drivers. We're seeing it in the inability of people to move product. And we have clients we talk to that are on both sides of the table. They're trying to buy wood for their mills. They're trying to ship lumber or end product to their customers. And they're literally like battling over the same driver to, hey, I need you to drive the flatbed. No, I need you to drive the log truck. And I've heard this story now more than once. So that the log trucking side is super challenging. Last slide. I'll just share a quick update on what's going on in the timberland investing sector. We're tracking constantly timberland deals and mill capital investment just to keep up with what's going on. And what this figure shows is it shows the volume in terms of acres on average of how many industrial or investable timberland acres are traded in the United States. On average, we turn over about 4% of the investable universe, but you can see, like in a typical year, we're trading about 2 and 2.5 million acres of timberland. And then we get these big spikes. 2016, that's when Weyerhaeuser and Plum Creek came together, and that's a transaction. So that's why that bar is so big. And if you look at the history of the timberland industry, you see this every 4, 5, 6 years, there's a really big deal. 2004 was International Paper, and then somebody else. In 2020, we had a real slowdown. And in 2021, we had a 60% increase in deals. And we've already passed 1 million acres in 2022. So there's a lot of stuff turning over right now in the sector. There are a lot of deals on the table in all parts of the country. 2021 in acres, the region that led the United States in deals, Pacific Northwest. So the West is participating in this as well, because often it's the South, but the West and the South, but last year was the West. And so that kind of activity is also really encouraging. I want to thank you for the invitation. I hope that some of these things are relevant to your work and provide some context and interest. And I welcome any questions you may have.
Okay. All right, thanks, Brooke. So yeah, go ahead and put you can either post your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can call on you. I'll go ahead and start the question. So Brooks, more from a maybe high level philosophical question of the fact that you started as a choker, you have the on the ground logging experience, and now you look at the data in terms of how the wood flows across the country. For you, kind of what is that? What do you see in that in terms of the consumption by the public and the fact that we're feeding what the public needs? And is that consumption going up, or could that consumption change as a result of people realizing we need to be planting more trees, or we shouldn't be cutting trees because of climate change? Kind of what have you come away maybe more philosophically about wood consumption in general?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I don't get one like that very often. And Andrea, I'm going to take my crack at this question the way I think about it, because I got into forestry. I mean, first of all, like I love trees, right? So like most of us just love forestry. We were talking about before the call about these other authors and researchers we were talking about, and I love the idea of sustainability. And I got into the private sector of it because I believe that really good private sector investments have to be sustainable themselves, right? So for a forest industry business to be sustainable, it has to be profitable. But for it to be profitable, it has to be smart with the resource. So these things have to align most of the time. And sometimes people make mistakes and sometimes they don't. So we're in the business of trying to help people avoid those mistakes. Get in a good spot, have a sustainable business that's good for everybody. So on the wood use side, it's interesting because more recently we've seen some changes in that. And so the reason we're so interested, I'm going to touch on in two different ways, Andrew. One is I want to talk about paper, and the other I want to talk about ESG, carbon. Because on the paper side, forestry depends a lot on having balance in our markets. Like if you don't have somebody to use chips and pulpwood, it actually makes it harder to manage forests for logs and lumber. This is stark in the South. It's stark in the Lake States. It's a little bit less of an issue in the West, although it's important because we generate so much chips and pulpwood down here. So balance is important. And when people are cutting out, when we're using more recycled and less raw wood, people need to find things to do with that material. And so I'm mindful. I view plastic as the enemy and wood as the good guy. So I'm a paper bag, not a plastic bag guy. I think about that. However, the flip side is that with housing, sometimes people ask me about, do we think that someday we're going to be building fewer houses of wood? And to me, the answer is no. I think that actually, when you think about everything that we build, if you believe growth is important, that wood is an answer to so many challenges. And I have more clients talking about carbon and environmental issues. And when you look at all the positives, the renewability and the way that we can actually fix our own homes better when they're made of wood, the investment outlook and the job outlook and the economic growth outlook for forestry based on solid wood products is really positive. And so it sort of makes me excited to be part of that sector, also being mindful that it has to be sustainable. That was a long, convoluted answer, Andrea. So you
Well,
got
actually,
me on
like I said, offline, we'll probably need to go more in that growth to drain models because I like to explore that a bit more.
Yeah.
Let's see. Krish Mace had a question. What is the log export market looking like out of the Pacific Northwest? China has been a big importer, but shipping costs, much like trucking costs, have pinched things off. Yeah. What are your observations on this?
Yeah. No, thanks for that question. That's where I started my career, was looking at the log export markets, and the tariffs we had to deal with several years ago were really hard. Now shipping costs are really hard. Now China's role actually with Russia is complicating policymakers' view on this outlook, this market as well. And then also we have not only that, but our export market interfaces or offsets a little bit with Canada's log export market too. So we have several challenges there. So there's two nice things about our export market. I mean, one nice thing is that we have both high quality and we have relative on a global basis for some of the whitewood products, relatively cheap wood sometimes on the hemlock. The thing that we don't understand right now, the part that we're struggling with, is what is China's role going to be this year because of Russia? The pressure from below. So when I say pressure from below, it means what supports our market is the fact that people are turning away Russian logs, who's one of the largest mover of raw logs in the world. And when you subtract out one of the biggest users of raw logs in the world, it opens up opportunities for others. And one of the countries it opens up opportunities for is the United States. And 80% of our really big log export activity on the softwood side is the Pacific Northwest. And so when you add those dots together, you have to think like we are where we are or better. Like I'm always looking, is the arrow going up or is the arrow going down? And when you take Russia out of the equation, there's a lot of reason to put the arrow up for the Pacific Northwest.
All right, well, there's one more question in the chat, but we need to transition over to the next
Yep.
speaker. So Brooks, if you wouldn't mind responding to Tom's question on there. And actually you're mentioning about, building with wood and houses is actually a nice ducktail into our next speakers. So I'll have Elijah make the introductions.
Thank you, and thanks for the questions.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you, Brooks, for giving us that wonderful talk. Super interesting.
No, I appreciate
Yes,
the invite. Thank you.
Okay, so for our next talk, we're gonna have Rob Janicki and Dan Rankin. So Rob is the owner of the RJ Group, which specializes in urban development. But before that, he spent several years working for his family company, Janicki Logging. Dan is the current mayor of Darrington, Washington since 2012 and was a council member there for 8 years before that. And he's been working to create long-term resilience for the local job market through building diversity and working with local, private, state, and federal partners. And today they're here to talk to us about providing some economic opportunities through forestry in the Darrington area. With that, I think I'll hand it over to you, Rob.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about the data in my presentation. First of all, thank you all for letting me speak. The Janicki family has been harvesting timber since just after World War I in the Pacific Northwest. And in the 80s, we began to accurately track the data on the timber we harvested. Most of the time we get paid on a per 1,000 board foot basis, or we purchase timberland on a per 1,000 board foot basis. So oftentimes you would hire foresters and people to do timber cruises. And after you did the timber cruises, you would look at your actual, what they call cutout, and you would compare your cutout to the timber cruises. And we would create tables and spreadsheets so that we'd be more accurate for the next time that we were going to be harvesting timber or purchasing timber. So through this process, over a 40-year period, we have built what we think are some of the most accurate timber modeling systems for actually looking at what type of timber comes out of a tree farm. And so this presentation is talking about carbon sequestration, but only within the barrel of the tree, the part of the tree that is economically valuable in today's market. So it doesn't talk about the root system or the branches or any of the other biomass, but just the sellable part of the tree, which we have a very accurate analysis of what that part of the forest looks like in the tree farms. And so with that, I'll get started. So basically where we're at is we wanted to take a look at the whole idea of carbon versus carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of myths about how much carbon dioxide does a tree absorb and how much carbon is in a tree. And it's two different things. And I kind of did some research and took it all the way down to the atomic level. And if you look at carbon dioxide, it's mostly oxygen by weight. And so when you start talking about absorbing carbon dioxide, what you're really doing is you're splitting the carbon molecule from the oxygen molecules. And that oxygen molecule, as we know, is the waste product in the photosynthesis process. So when you look at photosynthesis and how that works, you're basically taking some carbon dioxide molecules, some water, having the sun chemically alter those chemicals, and you end up with a hydrocarbon and a bunch of oxygen released. And so that light energy basically takes carbon dioxide, makes this very complex hydrocarbon, which is the tree. And we wanted to understand, if you're going to be in the business of absorbing carbon dioxide, which the timber industry does, you need to make sure that the data that we're presenting to people is accurate. So we did a real close look at carbon dioxide in trees. And This is, a lot of studies have been done, but basically in the Pacific Northwest, which is my area, most conifer trees are about 50% carbon by weight. And then the other part is oxygen and some other components. But if you just look at a live tree, which obviously has a lot of water in it, it takes about 1 ton of carbon dioxide to equal 1 ton of tree. So when people start talking about, and again, when we're talking about the ton of the tree, it's the barrel of the tree that we can sell to people that actually has economic value. So we started looking at this a lot more in detail because obviously as an economic engine, we want to make sure that we are trying to manage trees first and foremost for the economic value, but it just coincidentally is that carbon absorption and the economic value of trees lines up very closely. And we've been working with a lot of tree farm owners who have multi-generational focus. And when you have a multi-generational focus, your goal may be to grow, you know, the maximum volume of tree per rotation versus growing the growing for you know, shareholder value. So, you know, obviously a lot of people are in that 32 to 40 year range, which is fine for them, but it doesn't necessarily generate maximum value per rotation and definitely not maximum carbon absorption. So we did a lot of studies, and this link, you'll get a link to this presentation, and every single one of these studies that we looked at are linked via this presentation. So you'll be able to go and look at the studies that have to do with this. But it was clear to us from our data and then from the studies that we looked at that younger trees have a higher growth rate of carbon absorption than older trees or forests. They just have more trees, there's more trees per acre, and their growth rate is faster. So they're absorbing carbon dioxide, not only on a percentage basis higher, but also on a absolute basis. They're growing faster, and as a result, they're absorbing more carbon dioxide. In the meantime, this fallacy that old growth trees are a great carbon sink is actually not true, because once a tree gets to a certain size, and when I was actively out in the harvesting timber back in the 80s, we were in some of the biggest old growth stands in America. And we had a stand in up above Mount Baker or Baker Lake, and it had about 25 to 30 trees per acre, and each tree was almost 5 feet in diameter at 200 feet. So these were big trees. It was Site 1 growing class, but these trees were maxed. They were at their maximum height, and they were growing at a very minimal amount. And there was a lot of mortality adjacent to these trees. So they had gone from several hundred trees per acre down to 25 trees. And all of those trees in between those 25 trees were now on the ground and basically off-gassing. So we took and looked at every sale that we had done in the last 40 years, and we took the spreadsheets from those and we looked at how much timber is there at any given age. And this is basically, we did a conversion of 1,000 board feet per acre and where it was. And that's why this starts at 20 years old, because that's when we first started effectively thinning timber stands. And below 20 years old, it's pretty much you know, a non-merchantable product. It doesn't mean there's not volume in there. This graph represents the board feet per acre that could be harvested at that time. And then we did a conversion to tons of tree per acre, and then we converted that to carbon dioxide absorbed per acre per year. And so generally speaking, if you're between 40 to 70 years old, you're going to be having the maximum amount of carbon dioxide absorbed. You still have a lot of trees per acre. The trees are absorbing at an incredible rate, and you're getting the maximum volume. And if you look at that from a board foot standpoint, most of you that are in the industry also know that, you might have, 3,000 or 4,000 board feet at 20 years old. You might have 10,000 board feet at 25 years old. But at 50 years old, you could have 50,000 board feet. So it's a big growth curve, and this kind of matches the J curve that people have seen in the timber growth that we've been part of. What we did notice is that as we looked at old growth forests that we have actually harvested, so this is not theoretical, this is actual cutouts, the volume from about 150 years old to 500 years old is pretty stable. It kind of maxes out, there are exceptions to it, but it kind of maxes out at about 100,000 board feet per acre. There's stands that get a little bit higher, but overall, 100,000 board feet per acre is a pretty common max board foot per acre. And so this will continue. And as a result, since your board feet per acre is not changing, your absorption per acre is not very significant. So, these are 50-year cycles that I put on here, and the absorption is, less than a ton per acre. Okay, let's talk a little bit about active timber management versus passive management. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media about if we just leave the forests alone, they'll act like a great carbon sink and they'll absorb. It's better than not being involved. And this is one of our tether operations. We're able to harvest timber and thin timber up to 100% slopes. I think this one's probably closer to 50%, but you can see the cable coming off the back of the machine. The machine on the far end there is cutting the trees down, and then the other machine is shovel logging them up the hill. So we started looking at, well, what does this look like if you look at it from a long-term perspective? And so we said, okay, if we don't harvest trees, you just let them grow, you're going to absorb a certain amount of carbon. And then at a certain point, at about 150 years, that absorption, the cumulative absorption is no longer going up. What's getting absorbed is about equal to what's being off-gassed. If you did 60-year rotations, which is what a lot of our customers are doing, it's a little bit more than the industry average, but it definitely hits the top of that J curve. You get a significant amount of additional carbon dioxide absorbed because each 60-year rotation, you're removing all that carbon from the stand and you're replanting and you're letting it grow for another 60 years. So that tends to increase your cumulative carbon absorption substantially. And then with intensive thinning, we have several customers that do either 1, 2, or 3 thinnings in their operations, and their volume per acre in a 60-year rotation is even higher. And I have a case study later that I will go through. Okay, one of the things that I really like about the timber industry is that we can be part of the climate change solution without needing subsidies from the government. In fact, my belief is that if we had less government intervention, we could even do a better job of providing climate change mitigation. And as you can see, if you have no harvest, you have no revenue, but the revenue per acre, the cumulative effect is significant. And there's enough money being made from the harvest of the trees to, again, absorb the cost of this, quote, climate mitigation. We believe that there's additional opportunities in the biomass that I'm not discussing, which is the branches and some of the other components that are left on the forest floor. But there is a lot of controversy about the forest stuff and what's scientifically good to remove from that forest stuff. So this is just using standard timber practices. And again, this is using 2022 dollars, which makes it look a little better because things are pretty good this year. Okay, so I'm going to get into an actual case study. This case study was brought to me by a longtime friend, and he offered to let me share this. It's a little bit old, the study, but we have since proven out most of these on a second and third rotation. So the case study has three different things. There's a type 0, which means there were 0 entries. Type 1 was 1 thinning entry, and type 2 was 2 thinning entries. This is out on the coast of Washington, and it's in a hemlock stand. For one reason or another, these three stands are next to each other, and all three got different, just by coincidence, different prescriptions. So if you can see here, there was the type 0 stand, which is right here in this area, and this was never touched. And then the type 1 stand was pre-commercially thinned, and the type 2 stand was commercially thinned. So they're all right next to each other. They all have the same sun angles, same elevations, and they were all, it was all naturally stocked. So in the 0 thinning entry, when they looked at this stand at 51 years old, and again, when you go onto the website, each of these pictures are linked, so you can, it has more information on each one. But it's about 360 trees per acre, about 37,000 board feet per acre. But note that the average DBH is 15 inches, and there is a lot of small chip and saw in this stand. The quality of the stand is significantly lower than the other stands. When we went to 1 thinning entry, so this was pre-commercially thinned, and you can see some of the old stumps down here from the pre-commercial cut. The average DBH went up, the number of stems per acre went down, and the volume went down, but the quality of the product went up significantly. When you went to 2 thinning entries, you first of all, you got a commercial cut, 14-inch average stump size, which brought some commercial volume to you, but also sequestered some of that product that would have just died anyway. You ended up with almost 50,000 feet per acre. So when you look at this, again, if you could, what I was doing is just taking the board feet and converting them to tons. But as you can see, that active management generated significantly more tons and volume per acre than the passive management. And the two thinning entries, again, does not even include the commercial thinning volume. But again, we're almost 40% more timber than the passive thing. And then even more importantly, the value per acre is significantly more. So not only do you get to absorb more carbon, you get to sequester more carbon, but your revenue goes up significantly. Okay, so a couple of conclusions to this. What we're realizing is that if we want to be optimizing carbon absorption, we really need to be focusing on active timber management in our forests. And when people say to you that, well, we're going to be doing carbon credits by doing passive management, what they're really saying is we are going to be absorbing less carbon than if we were doing active management. And somehow politically, that's a better solution than doing what the science shows, which is that active management definitely produces more carbon absorption, optimizes that carbon absorption. And then if you do a final harvest every 60 years, you significantly increase that carbon sequestration by doing that versus doing nothing at all. So I do want to let you know that we have a lot of sources, and these are all linked to the actual studies, and we appreciate your time.
Nice. Thanks, Rob. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dan and to talk, and he'll talk about the other component to this project, which is the Wood Innovation Center up in Darrington. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm Dan Rankin from the town of Darrington, Pacific Northwest. And the project that I've been working on for about 7 years is trying to reimagine my community through the forest industry. The town of Darrington has been in the timber business since the 1920s. Where the land allocations here is primarily Forest Service. And so in the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994, the timber industry kind of hit the skids in the Pacific Northwest. And my community has been trying to recover from that era since 1994. About 7 years ago, I started to look into the mass timber industry and what that could mean for the Pacific Northwest and the United States, and more specifically, my community of Darrington. In that 7 years, I've done a lot of research about what mass timber has to offer as far as a building product, what it means for carbon sequestration going forward, and carbon reduction from the non-use of concrete and steel. So what I look at economically is from a small remote rural community on the western slope of the Cascades that was once a very vibrant and wealth generating community, to now where 40 to 60% of residents in my community commute out of Valley to jobs in the technology centers of the I-5 corridor. And with that migration every morning, the dollars are spent outside of our community. A lot of times, especially young parents will take their kids out of our school and put them in a school that's closer to their work. And so from the economics, we look at it from a drain. The other aspect of that is our young people coming out of high school, when they go off to college, they're not returning to jobs here in our community. They're staying away and pursuing things elsewhere as much as they'd like to return. So what I've been working on with the help of Portera and other industry folks is to create a wood innovation center. And the aspects of that wood innovation center can include mass timber. In this case, it'll be cross-laminated timber. It's a glued product. It'll include a sawmill, as well as a modular manufacturing component. And each one of these pieces add from a kind of farm to table effort, where the timber that's grown in the forest lands around us makes a short trip to the mill, which makes even a shorter trip across the parking lot to a cross-laminated production facility, where high-tech jobs and engineering and architecture all take place on the floor. It then goes across the parking lot to a modular manufacturer that creates components not only for single-family homes, but for skyscrapers. And here in Washington State, you can build up to 18 stories with all wood buildings designed out of cross-laminated timber. So you have all of this work happening right at an epicenter where trucking costs, shipping costs, and all those things are much reduced. Then we transfer that, put it on a truck, and it goes to the urban core. Those come off of trucks and develop that whole building in a series. And that building is shipped pretty much complete. It's supposed to be 80% complete. And when it arrives on site, so the trips on our highway, the trips in town, the traffic, all those things are reduced overall through this process. So let's see. So when we look at it from, what that means for my community economically, it comes down to not only having the generated revenue from the businesses that are occupying space, but also the benefit of our residents staying in our community and participating in our community. Commuters, our studies show that our commuting traffic spends at least 10 hours a day away from home. That doesn't leave them any time to be on PTSA or coach Little League or be involved in our community in any way, shape, or form. Bringing those back home, those jobs, bringing those back home allows those activities to happen, but also bolsters our service industry through our restaurants. It also makes our hardware and grocery stores start to thrive. And on the back burner of this, the Wood Innovation Center has to have an education component to it. And this is where you all come in. We want to look at education not only for the products manufacturing industry, we want to look at it all the way around. So it's a full circle where forestry and timber technology and logging technology intertwined with an end user product right here close to home. So I don't have any slides to show you all this one stuff, but Phil, I take any questions that you have to offer.
Nice. All right. We'll open up. Well, I'll go ahead and let's start the question. So when do you expect to break ground then on this center?
We're going to break ground this year in 2022.
Nice. Good. Nice. Nice. And so Rob, for you, have you presented your presentation around the studies and such around the carbon sequestration, active management to other groups, or what's been the reaction when you've talked about it to other folks, primarily in the urban area?
The Department of
It's been, go ahead, Rob.
The Department of Natural Resources in the Northwest region is under a lot of pressure by their boss and lands person to reduce the harvest up here. And I presented to them and received significant number of questions about if they could have copies of this, if they could share this. So it is now linked to the Janike logging website and is available to everyone. And we're going to continue to update it. We also are planning on partnering with Huxley College, which is the environmental college at Western, and having them create a peer-reviewed version of our study so that it won't be industry sponsored, but it will be have that capability of looking at it from more of a academic standpoint, because the data is there. It's just a matter of getting people to understand the data.
Nice. And kind of what do you, for Dan, kind of what do you expect the production capacity of the center will be maybe in the first year or so? What's your kind of long-term goal for production?
So what I've been told, and since I'm part of town government, I kind of I work really hard at keeping out of the private side of that aspect, but they're looking at about 20 million board feet initially per year for annual log intake. And so that would equate to about 35 million board feet of lumber per year.
Nice. And so with that, for Rob, kind of, is there the contractor capacity then, knowing there's going to be this demand for the center, will you be able to supply it?
You know, I think that the DNR needs to do their part to not be taking additional timber that was actively managed out of the marketplace. But I think we have the capability and the capacity to bring that product to the market. But like your previous presenter said, right now we have a crunch in hauling. Log hauling is limiting the capacity of the industry right now, but I do believe that we can work on trying to figure out a way to resolve that. Again, we need to get more people and we need to pay them more to make this work. But I do think the economics is there, and really what it comes down to is if the economics are there, entrepreneurs will figure out a way to provide that service. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Nice. We got one comment in the chat, or a comment. So mass timber is a great way to store carbon for the long term. Another aspect to consider, especially if you are doing mid-rise construction that likely replaces steel and concrete, which is a very carbon intensive emission products when produced. Thanks. Nice. Okay. Nice. And I will say too, one thing I do like about the forest to home model is the fact that it is connecting, you know, rural areas and forestry to urban and affordable housing, and making that connection, and especially increasing the capacity of affordable housing, which we desperately need as well. Okay.
And, you know, I'm going back to your previous question, you know, I've worked closely with Forterra. Forterra is our private partner, or aspects of Forterra, which is a conservation community conservation organization in the greater Seattle metro area. You know, and part of that equation is education, and that if we're looking at concrete and steel, and we're looking at what benefits we have and what are coming forward by using timber and by using wood as a carbon sump, you know, it becomes an education factor for a lot of folks. It's an aha moment when they consider the use of concrete and steel over wood in any aspect. We know that concrete and steel are not going to lose a huge amount of market share in that from mass timber, but every little bit helps when we talk about carbon.
Nice, thank you. All right, we have a management question or a technical question. For Rob, if I saw the thinning study slide correctly, I noticed that the second entry, trees per acre at final harvest or at time of data collection, was quite a bit higher than the others. Any idea why?
We have found, and we work with a company from Germany that owns 30,000 acres in our region, and they've been doing timber management since 1100, when a knight fought bravely in a battle and the king gave him part of the Black Forest. So they are definitely multi-generational, and they started thinning long before it was considered in vogue. And what they found is that trees can only compete so much with each other. And if you make trees have to compete with each other and they have to naturally thin themselves, they go into a suppressed mode. And once they are in that suppressed mode, they will actually reduce their carbon absorption. And it has to do with the photosynthesis engine, which is the live crown. So if you can keep the live crown to about 1/3 the total length of the tree, then you will get maximum photosynthesis, which is maximum carbon absorption, which is maximum growth. And so those studies proved out that you get almost 50% more timber volume in a 50-year-old stand that's been thinned twice than in a stand that has no thinning. So the numbers were pretty amazing, but they're proving out over and over again. And I own about 4,000 acres, in all of our stands we do 3 thinnings instead of just 2. And again, that the third thinning is, almost 10,000 feet per acre that we're taking out, but then we're still getting that, high volume in that final harvest.
Nice. It looks like you might have answered this question in the chat. Did you use a variable conversion from board feet to tons of carbon in your analysis?
Yeah, and what I did was, if people that are in the industry know that you could have a log truck load that has 3,000 board feet on it, or that, that same truck could have 9,000 or 10,000 board feet on it. And the difference is not the truck, it's the logs on that truck. And so we have over the years done a conversion system based off the age of the tree, and we've calculated, and that's how we calculate the tons per board feet, is based off of, how many board feet can you haul on the load? And then the load is somewhere between 25 to 34 tons, depending on if it's a heavy hauler or not. And so it has skewed a little bit because back in the 80s, we did not have heavy haulers. So we probably need to be a little more refined in our studies, but it's within the margin of error.
Great. All right. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. So if anyone has any other questions for Dan and Rob, go ahead and post them in the chat, and I will send them to them after the meeting. But otherwise, thank you both, Rob and Dan, for coming out. And I'll turn it over to Elijah.
Thank you, Andrea and Elijah. Great to be here. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for coming out and talking. Really appreciate it. Next up, I think I'll pass over to Gene, but we've got 2 groups of students that will be talking to us about macroinvertebrates in different environments and how their diversity changes. So Gene, are you guys ready to present on your side?
We're ready. Can you hear us here at Green River?
Oh, okay, perfect. Yes.
All right, excellent. Well, my name is Monica Preeb, and I had the distinct pleasure of teaching these students this last quarter. And I'm really proud to present to you guys the work done by Parker Antone, Rosalind Ashley, Sierra Bleakley, and Shelly Pasco. Today presenting are Shelly, Parker, and Sierra. So with that, I'll hand it over to them and they'll share their screen.
Hello, guys.
Okay. Hi. Hello, see everybody? Want to share your screen? Oh.
That guy.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. Is it there? Alrighty. So we set out to sample 2 wetlands on campus, both freshwater, both forested, both draining, a residential area. One is a longtime wetland, has been here forever. The other one is a constructed wetland that was built 10 years ago to help clean the water that comes out of that residential area on its way to the Green River. And so what we expected to find was that the natural wetland had higher diversity in macroinvertebrates than the ephemeral constructed wetland, and which is what we found, but we were surprised at just how different it was.
Yeah, during our research, we took different materials out with us. We took a D-net, PVC pipe, and as well as like tubs and spoons to look at the macroinvertebrates we observed. And like as Shelley said, in the naturally made wetland, it did show a higher diversity in different types of macroinvertebrates, but in the book that we were referring to, it was only really talking about like stoneflies, mayflies, or caddisflies, while we had like bacteria, beetles, all sorts of different things, worms, and those couldn't be accounted for. But yeah, that's how we went about it.
So,
Also,
oh, sorry.
that's good. It's also hard to identify all of them just because like the book that we were running off of was for like streams and stuff. So there was a bunch that like, oh, we had to Google it, look it up. And there's some that like, yeah, it took a long time to try to identify.
So our plan was to use the Hilsenhoff index to compare our macroinvertebrates, but the diversity of macroinvertebrates that we found were not things that were accounted for in the Hilsenhoff index. We found a lot of crustaceans and mollusks and flatworms, and a lot of diversity within those groups, but not the organisms that Hilsenhoff used. And so we determined that while the natural wetland had a greater macroinvertebrate diversity and thus better water quality, we really needed a better index to truly reflect how much healthier that wetland ecosystem is than in the constructed wetland ecosystem.
Which is important because I mean, there's going to be, you know, wetlands in developments, housing developments, and they're building them, they're continuing to build them, and it'd be good to kind of have an idea of like the water quality metrics, knowing if it's healthy, you know, where that water bleeds into, and being able to have that index would be important to do just that.
Especially as more and more often natural wetlands are being swapped out, and construction companies tend to say, well, we can just build a new wetland, where obviously they're very different. Even though they may look like a constructed wetland, may look like a natural wetland on the surface, they're actually quite different when you get down to the actual health of the ecosystem.
Yeah, much more of a Band-Aid for the ecosystem. It's not really like, yes, it's helping us and the animals and everything involved with it, but as our results and data has occurred and showed that it's better in the natural ecosystem, and that can actually give our natural environment better health overall. And that's all we have. If you have any questions, free to ask.
Nice, I do. So was there any, visually, what was the differences then between the natural wetland and the constructed wetland?
You mean like in terms of vegetation?
In vegetation, or maybe, yeah, is like soil layers, did you have to dig down any soil layers to see if there were any differences there? Or?
So when we sampled, we didn't go very deep. The guidelines that we used called for just barely disturbing the substrate. And so, so I don't know about the different soil layers, but vegetationally, there's a lot more diversity in the natural wetland. There's a lot of shrubs and a lot of tree cover and just things that reflect a lot of time, where the constructed wetland, while they put native plants in, it's only had 10 years to grow.
Along with the the man-made wetland, actually part of it was taken up by the reservoir beds. So they had to make up for that on the other side of it by mimicking it, which is not, it's a way to handle it, but it's not the way it should go about.
Are there any other questions?
We did, yes. Can you talk a bit more about the constructed wetland? What type of site was it before the restoration effort, and what type of restoration was done?
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Good.
Not sure.
Go ahead.
Well, beforehand, all the water was running down the parking lots of the Green River campus, and it was going into the streets, and that's collecting all types of pollutants, and it can even pick up really anything that's on the street and bring it into the waters that were naturally already there. So the constructed wetland is to help manage that. So beforehand, it was just more so of like mass amount of poor water quality on the campus.
Like a sump.
Yeah.
And it's actually a series of three constructed wetlands, 3 basins, and we sampled the middle one. So that's also the deepest. And so the point of constructing that was to collect all the water runoff from the residential area and the parking lot and slow it down and help settle out some of the contaminants on its way to the river.
All right. Anyone else have any questions? Or also, when you were out there sampling, again, was there any members of the public nearby? Did anyone see you or ask questions? Or
A few people did walk by on the trails, and they were really interested in what we were doing. So
Yeah, they were wanting to look at the bugs. They wanted to know if we could eat the shrimp that we found. They're very small, so if you want, but.
the trails here, we sampled on the weekend, and so the trails are pretty active and it was a nice day. And so there was plenty of people walking around.
nice. Or did you have any pitfalls at all while you were doing the sampling?
Did we have? I don't remember any. The natural wetland took us considerably longer to sample because there were so many things to count. I don't think that I would call that a pitfall because we were all having a lot of fun.
Nice. It looks like Chantal, did you have a question? Did you ever hand raise?
No, I was just sort of clapping. Go Green River.
Nice. Okay, so it looks like, there was a comment about, in regards to what it looked like beforehand. It said the area was a forested area before construction with an ephemeral stream running through the area. Sandbags were used to form a bit of the dam to create the wetlands. Okay, nice. And do you think that since it's only been 10 years since the wetland's been in place, that it will improve over time, or maybe just because of where it is and how it was constructed, that it won't become natural, in some ways, a quote unquote natural state?
I think the fact that it's ephemeral rather than perennial has more to do with how diverse and healthy it would end up being as a wetland, but it would be really interesting to continue to survey it in the years to come and see how it improves.
Nice, okay.
Along with that man-made one, it is a 10-year process. So they started thinking about making this whole plan 10 years ago. And then they stopped they put down the last sandbag, maybe 7 years into it. So it's really only a couple years old, but it's still, I think in the future, it's going to help with the runoff.
It's okay. Nice. And so are there any, based upon what you collected now, are there any other questions that you think maybe could have been asked at the same time, or what do you want to ask next if you're going back into these wetlands?
I think I would like to do the same kind of a survey in other locations to see if this is actually a representative comparison of the two different types of wetland. Just to get a bigger idea of what the scope of it is. And then I would really like to know how many of these constructed wetlands there are just in King County or in Washington State or anywhere, because I see them all the time, but it's really hard to find that data and to get an accurate number.
Okay. Yeah, because I'd certainly be interested to know what is the recommended way of constructing a wetland. So
Right. And yeah, because some of them are just a hole in the ground with some grass around the edges. And I mean, some have had a lot more work put into them like this one, but yeah, I think there's a lot more to study here.
nice. Okay. Looks like we got a question. So it says, your research indicates that natural wetlands are better than constructed wetlands. Does Green River plan to continue studying this long term, and any plans to continue? Yeah.
I believe so. I think that the plan called for a 10-year review. I'm not sure past that.
We'd like to look more into it. We'd like to have more students look into this and see what else is out there and see what results are over time. We'd love the teachers to try to put that into their work as well. Like, they matter a lot.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, anyone else have any other questions? See, oh, actually, okay, so we got one question. Should you seed a constructed wetland with benthic macroinvertebrates?
I don't know without researching that, but I would think that it would, in an ephemeral wetland, there probably isn't the water availability to keep them alive year round. But there may be species that are suitable to an ephemeral situation that could be seeded.
Nice.
But I don't know, I'm guessing.
And so I assume too that the plants that they plant, the natives they planted there are adapted then to ephemeral streams, so knowing the area is going to dry out, I assume during the summer.
I would assume that as well. And since they were planted some time ago, the ones that survived have obviously they're suitable for that area.
Yes, okay. Yes. All right, so it looks like, so just a comment someone shared. WashDOT has an extensive wetland mitigation and monitoring program due to the law of no net loss. And so every time a road is impacting a wetland, so they may be a great resource for data.
Right, and I did visit that when we were researching, but I couldn't find an actual number of constructed wetlands that had been done.
Okay.
There's a huge document that, I mean, huge, thousands of pages. And I didn't find that number, the magic number.
And so you already might have mentioned this. Was the forested wetland also an ephemeral as well? So does it have a similar water regime? That might be the wrong word, but is it year-round water or is it also ephemeral?
Which, the constructed one or the natural?
The forested.
Well, they're both forested.
Oh, okay.
The constructed one was, it dries up.
Okay.
So, no,
But the natural
Yeah.
one is perennial.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other questions or? All right. Looks like that's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I think, Monica, you have another group of students. Is that right?
I'm very excited about it. Let's see here. I'm going to get their presentation pulled up because we are sharing the same computer. So come on up if you guys want to pull this up how you see fit, and I'll go ahead and introduce them while they're getting ready here. So we have Jesse Rogers presenting with Melissa and Kira. And so they took advantage of the atmospheric river weather events that we've been having here in the Pacific Northwest, and were able to adapt their research on benthic macroinvertebrates around how increased atmospheric river events may be impacting these systems at an ecological level. So as soon as they get this pulled up, we'll have them share the screen. And if you go to presentation mode there, Jesse. There we go. All right, we'll let them take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we actually were pretty fortunate to be able to do this study. As some of you may or may not know, we've had a lot of atmospheric river weather events come through Western Washington in particular. That's what we're looking at. Causes a large amount of flooding. And so we were kind of curious about what other kind of disturbances happen due to these weather events. So to give some context for this, average rainfall in Seattle for the past 20 years, according to NOAA, is about 3.43 inches a month. And the weather event that we looked at spanning 6 days dropped 5.24 inches of rainfall. So pretty, quite a lot more. Benthic invertebrates are important components of stream ecology and also serve as health indicators. So again, we were kind of curious about what kind of impacts these weather events were going to have on the stream. Knowing how these disturbances impact communities, because they are so important, is kind of what we were looking at. So again, the event that we looked at was occurred at the end of February this past year, and spanned 6 days, and had us asking the questions, what, if any, effect do the atmospheric rivers have on invertebrate communities in low order stream?
Some of the methods we used to collect our data. Well, first we collected with the class on February 17th of this year. Then the rain fell and we were able to do our comparison collection on March 4th and 6th. And when we went out there, we measured Fox Creek, and we measured it was about 550 feet long, was accessible, 550 feet was accessible. Some of it was just too deep for us to get into. We made 15 plots, spaced them out about 35 feet apart, and we used a D net to collect the invertebrates. We agitated the sediment and massaged the rocks a little bit to get the bugs off for 1 minute. And then we took them back to the shore and counted and identified them. We used microscopes and our books from our class to figure out what we were looking at. And then we also used the Shannon diversity test to compare the data from both collections.
So the results from the data collected before and after the atmospheric river event showed similar species in Fox Creek. However, after a Shannon's diversity test was conducted, the richness and evenness was observed to have dropped after the atmospheric river event. The overall richness before the atmospheric river event was 1.65 and dropped to 1.47. The overall evenness before the atmospheric river event was 0.289 and had dropped to 0.258. Along with that drop, there was also a decline in numbers of several species previously found in Fox Creek.
So I think one of the interesting questions to come out of this is with the impact that this one weather event had, if these things happen 3 or 4 times during the course of a winter, what kind of impact does that have overall? Do the bugs leave and come back, or are they washed away for good? How long does it take to have them find their way back into a stream? If in fact they've gone into hiding, if they get washed away, then how long is it going to, take other insects to find the stream again and start to repopulate it? So I think it'd be really interesting moving forward and kind of for the next few years for students in the same class to be able to go back and revisit Fox Creek, especially. And I imagine that these weather events are going to continue to happen. We've seen them kind of pick up, especially this past year. So I can imagine that they'll continue to occur, and it'll be interesting to know what the students in the future come up with and find out to see if these do have a big impact. I think one thing that I would have liked to have gone back to look at is just to monitor that same creek for an extended amount of time after the weather events happen, so that we can get a better gauge on what was there before, what was there after, and if the evenness and richness does continue to rebound or if it stays at those lower levels. Anything else you want to add? I think that's all that we have. Are there any questions?
Yeah, so looking at the atmospheric river, so you mentioned that, if it could be an issue if it happens more frequently, but could timing also be an issue upon the diversity of the species and a number of them, if it happens earlier or later in the season?
I think the impact would come depending on their reproductive cycle and I guess how well their larvae would survive any kind of event like this. Is the insects themselves are typically mobile and can move in and out if they need to, whereas larvae and things in eggs and that sort are still waiting to hatch. They can't go anywhere, and so yeah, potentially there could have a bigger impact depending on the time of the year and reproductive cycle of the species.
Okay. In the discussion, you mentioned that it could have been disturbed. So did I read right that it sounds like that people could be walking through the stream, adding to the disturbance?
Yeah, it's a small section of the trail at the state park there, but people were having to walk through it. So disturbing the substrate, kind of loosening up the sediment, having to travel downstream potentially could, cover up insect eggs or something like that. I don't think it was really a huge impact. I think that we probably had more of an impact walking up and down collecting our data than any trail users would have. But they were there, and so we wanted to mention it.
Nice. Okay. Nice. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat or raise your hand. Nice. So if you were to go back and do the study again, is there anything you would do different, or any other question, or any other data you would collect in order to answer another question that you now have?
I would have liked to have been able to have gotten out there quicker after the flood, but just life got in the way, and we got out there as soon as we could. But I would have liked to have gotten out there a couple days earlier if possible.
Okay, looks like there's someone from Green River College. Is that Jean has a question?
Me, yeah, you're within the class of students. Yeah, so my question is, did you notice a pattern with the species that disappeared, where they say the rarer species to begin with disappeared, or was there maybe a mass related? If the heavier ones remained, the lighter ones, smaller ones disappeared? Did you notice any sort of pattern?
That's a good question. I would want to, I don't know, I'd have to look at the data.
From the data that we collected, we did notice a trend. The very heavily populating species in the stream did show up before and after. We did lose quite a few species that had kind of trickled throughout our data that we collected prior to the atmospheric river event. So yes, we did lose some species after that.
And could there be anything done to the vegetation around? I mean, could the stream be managed a bit differently to help prevent the loss of these invertebrates after a river event?
Yeah, so Fox Creek is a recently renovated creek in the state park. And so it's basically a restoration site. A stream channel was recreated and planted with native species and that sort of thing. So I think as time moves on and the stream is there longer, then hopefully more bugs will find it and call it home. And then as all that vegetation grows up, and obviously a long time down the road, but as it grows up and then falls into the river, it's going to create a lot more structure in the river where the invertebrates will be able to shelter or use as habitat and that sort of thing. So I think this is still early. I don't remember quite how long it's been since that stream was recreated, but it is still relatively young. So I think the hope is that it continues to help with the function of the area and also kind of provide that structure as it gets older.
Yeah, going off what Jesse said, I kind of wanted to add, I think that the addition of large woody debris could possibly help this as well. It would, in my opinion, I think that it would help slow these events from just washing out the stream. So I think that could help too in future events.
Nice. All right. Anyone else have any other questions? No.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Super interesting presentation. All right. Well, I think with that, then we'll probably start to close up the day. That was our last presentation. We're finishing a little bit early again. So, Andrew, I think there is a credit survey that you just posted.
Yeah, just shared the CFE survey. So if you can, the Doug Fur, the meeting password is secret word is in there as well. So you can fill out the survey, with the password, and we'll get you the CFE credits.
All right. Well, just to set us up for tomorrow, just to remind everyone that the business meeting is tomorrow, which is on a separate Zoom link. If you look at page 3 of your programs, it's the one to the right. It says WSSAF business meeting. That'll be at 10:30 a.m. So just a little bit before our normal conference, if you'd like to join. And I think otherwise, not anything else to touch on too much. Thanks everyone for coming. I guess the only other thing I say is that tomorrow's theme is inventory and technology. So, you know, if that's of interest, make sure you show up. Otherwise, thanks for attending. Thanks to all the speakers today. All your talks were great and I really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.
Bye.
All right. I think we'll hang out a little bit too if anyone has any questions. But otherwise, that's it.